Welcome to the Equity Conscious Leader, a new generation equity podcast and YouTube channel where we chat with leaders about tangible system change and strategies to advance and sustain equity work in their organizations. Our conversations dive deep into the 6 dimensions of equity conscious leadership. So how do you lead with transformational system change for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? Let's find out on this episode of the Equity Conscious Leader with your host and educational equity leader, Dr. Jag Lathan.
So really that's important, is understanding, that truth piece. So we've had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which examined the legacy of residential schools. We've had an inquiry into the murder of missing Indigenous women and girls, the two-spirited people. We had the RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, historically in the 90s. So we've done a lot of analysis around what has happened, and there are so many recommendations of things that should change. And I think that's an area where we really do need to see some more movement, but having a broader understanding of how we got here is really crucial, because as things are coming to light, there's this wave of denialism, like it wasn't that, or it was like, the standards of the day, or, we really need to look on the bright side because look at all of the good that came from, whatever has taken place. And I think, the truth can be, multifaceted and complex and leave space for lots of experiences, but we do need to contend with what's happened in order to be able to move forward. And we can't just wash it over, because then people don't feel heard, felt, seen, or understood. And so how do you build a relationship with somebody who doesn't feel like you've seen them, who doesn't understand them, right? Because you know where they're coming from.
I love that. And part of it is kind of the harm that has been done to folks. And I will say, like, just being a part of the African diaspora, oftentimes Black folks in the United States have not been heard, right? Or even past experiences that currently affect us today aren't necessarily explored, right? And so part of this work is about illuminating, that like systemic oppression is real, and it started from when African people were brought to this country, for example, right? And it just continues when you think about Jim Crow, redlining, like all of that, it all plays a role, and that was all harmful. It continues to cause harm for many Black people and communities. So I hear the kind of a connection there in terms of like, what does it actually mean to engage in this work, and starting from a place of healing.
Yeah, absolutely. Often what we hear is like, well, it was so long ago. And the reality is, like, the last residential school closed when I was in grade 8. So I don't know how many people, my age, I'm turning 40 this year, would consider grade 8 in history, right? Like, it wasn't that long ago. And the reality is that the things that have happened, even in the last 50, 60 years have an impact today. It's not like it was something that just happened and there was nothing that flowed from it. So really understanding how what's happened has led to the current situation is really crucial, because it's easy to write something off as something that happened in the past, but we really need to understand it continues to have an impact.
Perfect. Thank you. Tell me a bit about some of the recommendations. I heard you say earlier that businesses reach out to you. Of course, they're purchasing your book, but they are asking for recommendations around the healing and reconciliation. What does that look like in terms of how businesses can actually move forward, considering what we just talked about?
For sure, yeah. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has a specific recommendation, number 92, around the corporate sector and reconciliation. And it's about creating Indigenous opportunity. It's about providing opportunities for employment and business and collaborations with long-term sustainable benefits. It's about education, not of your existing staff that you're going to be bringing people in. Often when I see is that business owners will want to try and just recruit a whole bunch of Indigenous people and get them jobs, and that's important. However, you need to make sure that you're ready to receive people. And so that's about, educating the staff who are there. That's about looking at what policies and procedures that you have in place and seeing if this is a place where people want to work and will feel safe to work, because it doesn't do anybody good to bring people in and then cause harm, right? That's the opposite of what you're wanting to do. So really spending that time to get ready to be in relationship, to do your homework and learn about the history, to learn about the experiences of the people that you're going to be welcoming in, and making sure that your staff understand for themselves, and also so that they can effectively intervene if they see their colleagues facing discriminatory behavior or negative commentary, to be able to empower them to have those difficult conversations and to be good allies in the workplace. So I think that's really a piece. And then it's also really looking at how company positions themselves and talks about things that are happening, whether they're acknowledging that things are happening and are difficult, whether they're acknowledging to their staff internally when, we have ongoing confirmations of grave sites that happen fairly regularly. So, how do we acknowledge that, people might be upset and sad thinking about the things that are coming to light, and really creating a space where there's situational awareness and emotional intelligence around having those conversations with the people that are in your world that you welcomed in as part of reconciliation.
Yeah. It's so important that you talked about the space, like what space are organizations or teams, leaders creating for people to have this dialogue. And part of the thinking for New Generation Equity is like, what structures are people actually putting in place and actually dealing with it? And I'll give you an example. When George Floyd was murdered, sometimes people didn't want to talk about it, right? So you go to work, people are like tiptoeing around this conversation, or they don't want to have the conversation at all. And for many folks, Black folks and other people of other ethnicities, were wanting to engage in this conversation because it was a point of harm, it was a point of hurt, and it illuminated this broader the broader challenges and harm that, has been from the police, criminal justice system, all of that. And so it was an opportunity to broaden the conversation. And many people in the United States did, and around the world, it broadened the conversations for them. But I just wanted to hear your perspective on how, when we think about structures, for example, I think about meeting spaces, right? Let's come together, let's have conversations, have some kind of protocols, community agreements, things of that nature, because the conversations could go in various ways. People have different beliefs, ideas, and experiences around, some of the areas that I just talked about. So that's one way I can see a structure, and that has been successful. I would love to hear from you, what other spaces and structures are you thinking about in terms of when organizations or leaders are wanting to engage their staff, for example, in conversations that lead to healing and reconciliation?
Yeah, I think it's important to make sure that staff know that, that there's space for those conversations, and that comes down to not having the rules about, I know it's base camp that have a restriction around political conversation, and it's just it's not politics that somebody's right? It only becomes politics, but it's not normative, right? When you have the majority of people who can talk about, their weekend when you maybe went to Walmart, or they went to the garden center or something, where somebody else's experience, where, their community has been harmed in this way, their weekend might have looked really different. And if you have barriers in place around that, those being no-go topics, makes it feel like only certain people are allowed to be themselves at work, and only certain people are allowed to share what's going on with them. And that can feel really isolating. And why would you want to be in a space where you're treated differently and your experiences aren't, allowed to be shared, right? So I think having that space is important, and then also having the education piece in place where staff are receiving mandatory regular training around issues so that they can participate in those conversations in a way that is, safe for their colleagues they're sharing, so they understand, so that their Indigenous colleagues aren't having to catch them up and educate them and perform that additional labor at a time when they're already feeling, tired, frankly tired, because it's tiring to be facing these situations on an ongoing basis. And having the burden of education is just really something that isn't a reason it's unreasonable.
Yeah, thank you. How can companies benefit? How can leaders benefit organizations from really thinking about the role that reconciliation and healing can play in their work?